On his birthday, surrounded by balloons and laughter, my grandson looked me in the eye and said with chilling ease, "You're not impressive." The room did not fall silent. No, that would have been easier. The chatter continued. The cake was being sliced. The children still shouted in play. But for me, everything stopped. His words, so casual, so thoughtless, fell heavier than any insult hurled in anger. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't rebellion. It was conviction. In that moment, I saw the truth of how he saw me, not as someone to admire, not as someone whose years meant anything, but as a shadow, unimpressive, forgettable. I had lived long enough to endure many wounds. I had been called names, dismissed by superiors, overlooked by those I worked beside. I had borne rejection and indifference in silence. But nothing cut as deeply as the quiet judgment in the eyes of someone who carried my blood. A stranger can mock you and you move on. But when the child of your child deems you unworthy, it pierces differently. It feels like history itself has erased you. He didn't say it with cruelty, not even with mockery. He said it with the cool indifference of truth, like someone stating the weather. The sky is gray, the air is cold, you're not impressive. And perhaps that was what hurt the most, because he believed it. To him, it wasn't an insult, it was fact. I sat there, hands folded, forcing a smile as though the words had slid past me. But inside I felt every year of my life crash down at once. Decades of sacrifice, nights of exhaustion, mornings of labor, all reduced to nothing in a single sentence. My memories rose in protest. The projects I had built, the students I had mentored, the lives I had touched. But those memories felt distant, invisible, because in his eyes, none of it mattered. He had grown in a world that worshipped noise and titles, fame and appearances, quiet work, steady dedication, invisible service. Those things were not impressive to him. I wanted to tell him stories, to show him photographs, to hand him the letters and records that still sat hidden in drawers, proof of a life not wasted. But I stayed silent, because what would words mean to someone who had already judged? I carried the weight of that sentence like a stone in my chest, its edges cutting deeper each time I drew breath. The laughter of others filled the room, but for me it was hollow, distant. I watched my grandson laugh with his friends, his eyes bright when he spoke of athletes, celebrities, men with medals and names in newspapers, and I knew then that he did not see me at all, not as I was, not as I had been. To him I was just an old man at the table, worn by years, fading into irrelevance. But deep inside, beneath the sting of his words, a truth burned. I was not what he said. My life was not empty. My story was not unimpressive. And though I did not know when or how, I knew that one day he would see. Not because I demanded it, not because I shouted my worth, but because truth always finds a way. That day had not yet come. For now, all I carried were the words of a boy too young to understand the weight of what he had spoken. Words that cut. Words that would echo long after the party ended. And in that echo, I felt the stirrings of something I had almost forgotten. The quiet certainty that justice waits, even in silence. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever heard words from someone close to you that cut deep, words you can't forget? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to life. Now, let's continue. I did not answer him. My lips stayed pressed into a thin smile, my hands resting calmly on the table, as though his words had rolled past me like wind against stone. But inside, those words did not pass. They sank. They echoed over and over, heavier with each repetition, until they became louder than the voices of everyone else in the room. "You're not impressive." I had endured harsher phrases in my life. I had been told no in meetings where everything was at stake. I had been mocked by strangers who did not know my name. I had been judged by superiors who thought me too quiet, too steady, too unwilling to shout my worth. But those wounds always came from outside, and I knew how to heal them. What I was not prepared for was this, a verdict spoken by my own grandson, spoken not in anger, but in indifference. It carried no rage, no spite, only certainty, and that certainty crushed me in ways anger never could. The party went on around me. Glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell, conversations tangled together in the air. No one else seemed to notice what had happened. To them, it was a normal evening. To me, it was a breaking point I could not name aloud. I sat in silence, staring at the crumbs of cake on my plate, the hum of voices blending into a blur, and yet inside my heart pounded, each beat carrying that same sentence like a hammer against stone. I thought of the things I had done in my life, the years of labor, the long nights spent away from family to provide for them, the quiet victories that were never celebrated in headlines but mattered all the same. I thought of the people who had once looked at me with gratitude, the projects that bore my fingerprints, though no one remembered the name attached to them. I thought of the sacrifices I had made in silence, the comforts I had given up so that others might stand taller. And now, all of it, decades of effort, years of sacrifice, was being measured by the careless eyes of a boy who saw nothing but absence. In that silence I wondered, was he right? Was my life unimpressive after all? Had I spent my years building something invisible, something no one would ever value? The doubt pressed against me with a weight I had not felt before. I had always known the world overlooked quiet men, but I had consoled myself that family, at least family, would remember. Now I sat in that room and realized even they had not. But silence does strange things. It can bury you, yes, but it can also sharpen you. As I sat there, pretending to listen to the chatter around me, I felt the sting of humiliation curl into something else, something not yet clear, but alive. A small, defiant flame flickered beneath the weight of those words. If he could not see me now, if they could not see me now, then perhaps one day the truth itself would speak louder than I ever could. I remained silent that evening. I swallowed the hurt, folded it into myself, and carried it home like a stone in my pocket. But silence is not the same as surrender. And though no one else heard it, deep inside me, something whispered back against his words. Wait. The silence after his insult was heavy, yes. But it was not the end. It was the beginning of justice, still unseen, waiting in the distance. At dinner, a week later, the words still hung in me like a wound that refused to close. My grandson sat at the table, his voice lively, his hands moving as he spoke with the careless confidence of youth. He listed the people he admired, famous athletes whose faces filled television screens, entrepreneurs whose names were splashed across magazines, celebrities whose lives glittered louder than truth itself. He spoke of them with awe, with shining eyes, with the tone of someone speaking about giants. My name never left his lips. I listened in silence, the clinking of cutlery filling the space between his sentences. The rest of the family smiled, nodded, encouraged his admiration, proud that he could name men and women who had made it. And yet I sat there like a ghost. The names he exalted, the legends he praised, none of them had ever touched his life directly. None of them had been there when his mother was sick, when the roof leaked, when the bills piled high. None of them had built the foundation of the very table where he sat. I had, and still, I was invisible. As he spoke, I studied the faces around me. My daughter smiled proudly at her son, her eyes glowing with the same admiration he gave to strangers. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair, nodding at the list of heroes, his pride more in the boy's eloquence than in the substance of what he said. And me? I was a shadow at the corner of their sight, an old man, tolerated, present, but no longer important. In that moment I realized something bitter. My family was divided, not by walls or distance, but by recognition. For them, greatness lived outside, in stadiums, in headlines, in the achievements of others. For me, greatness had always been in the quiet things. Roofs built, meals provided, hands held in moments of despair. Theirs was a world of spectacle. Mine was a world of sacrifice. And between those two worlds stretched a chasm my grandson could not yet cross. I felt the words rise in my chest. Words that wanted to remind him of everything unseen. I wanted to tell him that impressiveness is not in applause but in endurance, not in fame but in faithfulness. I wanted to say that the very ground he stood on had been laid stone by hands that asked for nothing in return. But the words caught in my throat, unspoken. I knew they would sound like bitterness, like an old man's complaint, and I would not give him another reason to dismiss me. So I stayed quiet. I chewed my food slowly, staring at my plate. My silence mistaken for disinterest, when in truth it was the weight of love bruised and left unrecognized. And all the while, my grandson's voice carried on, filling the room with names that meant everything to him, and the absence of mine, which meant everything to me. When the dinner ended, laughter still in the air, I remained behind at the table for a while. My hands rested on the wood, the same table I had helped build years ago when money was scarce and every nail felt like a victory. My family had forgotten the story of this table, just as they had forgotten mine. And sitting there alone, I realized, sometimes betrayal is not loud. Sometimes it is as simple as being erased from the stories your own family tells. It happened not at the table, not in front of the family, but in the hallway, where words are spoken with the false safety of thinking the person they cut will never hear them. My grandson stood with his friends, boys his age, their voices bright with the arrogance of youth. They were laughing, comparing stories, boasting about parents and relatives, measuring their pride by names and titles. And then, casually, without hesitation, I heard him say it. My grandpa, he never accomplished anything. The words froze me where I stood. I had been on my way to the kitchen, carrying nothing but a glass in my hand, and suddenly it felt as though the weight of the world had been dropped on my chest. His voice carried not hatred, not malice, only indifference. That made it worse. He wasn't trying to insult me. He was stating it like fact, like it was something already decided, something the world had already judged. I pressed my back against the wall, listening to their laughter spill out, careless and cruel. His friends echoed him, not with mockery, but with that silence of agreement, the kind that tells you they believed him. In their minds, I was nothing more than an old man with no story, no achievements worth remembering, invisible, forgettable. I had heard strangers say worse in my life. I had been belittled, overlooked, told I wasn't enough. But from my own grandson's lips, those words burned deeper than any insult I had ever endured. He was the child I had once held in my arms, whose tiny hands had clung to mine, who had run through the house with laughter that healed even my most tired days. I had carried him on my shoulders, told him stories, saved coins to buy him small gifts, all in the hope that one day he would look at me with pride. And now, years later, that same child stood a few feet away, telling the world I had never been anything at all. The glass in my hand trembled. My throat ached with words I could not say. I wanted to step forward, to confront him, to remind him of the life he did not see, the sacrifices hidden in silence, the nights I worked when others slept, the foundations I built quietly while others sought applause. But I remained where I was, rooted to the floor, my silence heavier than stone. Because if I spoke, if I revealed I had heard him, it would change nothing. His heart had already judged me. His eyes had already erased me. I returned to my room quietly, closing the door with care so no one would notice, and there, in the stillness, I sat with the echo of his words. He never accomplished anything. I repeated them in my mind until they carved themselves into me like scars. And yet, even as they wounded me, I felt something rise beneath the pain. Memory. I remembered the bridges I had helped repair, the classrooms where I had spoken, the people who had once come to me for guidance. I remembered the gratitude in their eyes, the letters I still kept tucked in drawers, proof of a life not wasted. My grandson didn't know, his friends didn't know, and perhaps my family had chosen to forget. But I hadn't. Still, it did not erase the wound. To be dismissed by the world is one thing. To be dismissed by your blood is another. In that moment, I realized a truth so bitter it nearly broke me. Sometimes the people you have given everything to will be the first to tell others you were nothing at all. I sat in silence, my hands resting heavy on my knees, and whispered only to myself, "One day, you will see. Not because I force you to, not because I beg you to, but because truth does not die just because someone ignores it." That night, I lay awake with his words pressing into me like thorns. They had cut me, yes, but they had also planted something. And though it was buried deep beneath the ache, I could feel it. A quiet seed of justice, waiting for its time to grow. I could not erase his words, but neither could I erase my life. The world may have forgotten, my family may have chosen not to see, but my memory was still alive, and in it lived the truth they ignored. When I closed my eyes, I could still feel the long nights when exhaustion pressed against my body like a stone, yet I pushed forward because others were counting on me. I remembered mornings when the sun rose not as a blessing, but as a reminder that I had only a few hours left to finish what needed to be done before another day of work began. There were years when I carried responsibilities that should have broken me, when every coin I earned disappeared into bills, into books, into keeping the family steady. I worked in silence, not because I wanted to be invisible, but because that was the only way life could continue for those I loved. While others were chasing applause, I was chasing stability. While others spoke loudly of their successes, I was bent quietly over tasks no one else was willing to finish. I remembered the little victories, victories no one else kept track of, but which I carried in the deepest part of me. The bridge that held because I had repaired it in freezing weather when no one else showed up. The students who had once stopped me in the hall to say thank you, their eyes shining with the knowledge that someone believed in them when the rest of the world didn't. The letters tucked away in drawers, written by hands that said, "You changed my path," even if no one else ever knew. Those letters are still there. No one asked to see them. No one cares to read them. But I know they exist, and I know what they mean. And I remembered sacrifice, not the grand, cinematic kind people admire, but the quiet, daily sacrifices that leave no applause. The coat I went without so my children could have new shoes. The nights I stayed awake to finish extra work so the family could afford even a small vacation. The opportunities I passed by because I knew if I took them, someone else in my family would pay the cost. These things were invisible, erased from memory the moment they were done. But I remembered them. Every one. Memory is heavy. It pressed against me as I lay awake in the night. Heavier than his words, heavier even than the silence of those who never defended me. Because I carried not just my years, I carried the weight of being unseen in them. I had lived, truly lived, but without witnesses who cared enough to keep record. And sometimes I wondered, does a life matter if no one remembers what it gave? But even as the question tore at me, I knew the truth. A life is not erased just because it is ignored. My grandson's eyes may not see it. His friends may not know it. My family may not value it. But my memory would not lie. I had been there. I had done the work. I had stood in the storms. I had given everything I had to give. And though the weight of that memory was crushing, it was also proof. Proof that his words were not the whole story. Proof that invisibility is not the same as emptiness. Proof that I mattered, even if the world around me was too blind to admit it. I sat alone with these memories, letting them rise like ghosts around me. They whispered to me in the dark, reminding me that while the world may choose to forget, the past cannot be erased. And though the weight of it nearly bent me, it also held me up. Because sometimes, memory itself is justice, waiting for its moment to step into the light. Doubt is a strange thing. It doesn't crash into you like a storm. It seeps in quietly, drop by drop, until you realize you're drenched. After my grandson's words, after the echo of his laughter with his friends, I began to feel that slow, steady rain of doubt settling into my bones. At first it was a whisper. Maybe he's too young to understand. Maybe one day he'll see. But as nights stretched long and mornings arrived heavy, the whisper grew sharper. What if he's right? I found myself staring at my own hands. The same hands that had carried tools, lifted weights, signed papers, written letters, steadied shoulders, built things that still stood. But when I looked at them now, I saw only wrinkles, veins pressing through skin like faded lines on an old map. What did these hands mean if no one remembered what they had done? Were they impressive, or had they always been ordinary, unnoticed, replaceable? I walked past old photographs tucked into frames, faces of people who had once stood beside me, smiles at banquets, gatherings at work, students lined up with certificates in hand. I saw myself there, standing in the background, always slightly to the side, never the one in front. And suddenly, those pictures didn't look like memories of a life lived. They looked like evidence that I had always been second, always invisible. What if all I had done was not enough? At night, I lay awake, listening to the quiet house, my thoughts heavier than the darkness pressing against the windows. I remembered the sacrifices I had made, but even those began to twist inside me. I had given so much, time, strength, dreams, and for what? If the ones I gave it for now believed I had done nothing, had I wasted it? Did sacrifice count if it left no story behind? If even your own grandson looked at you and saw emptiness? Doubt feeds on silence, and I gave it plenty. I didn't tell anyone what I was feeling. I didn't ask my daughter if she remembered the nights I stayed awake to keep the family afloat. I didn't ask my wife if she still held gratitude for the years when my hands built the life around her. I didn't ask my friends, long scattered, if they thought of me still. Instead, I let silence wrap around me, and in that silence, doubt grew louder. I looked at the world outside and felt it racing ahead, faster than I could keep up. New names filled the news, young faces claimed victories, great achievements were celebrated in bright lights and applause. And me? I felt like a stone left behind on a shore, the tide moving on without me, my presence barely noticed. Perhaps my grandson had only spoken aloud what everyone else had quietly believed for years, that I was no longer relevant, that my story had already ended, that nothing I had done mattered anymore. There is a pain deeper than insult. It is the pain of believing your own life may have been meaningless. I carried that pain in silence, letting it gnaw at me, letting it question everything I had once been proud of. The weight of memory, which had once steadied me, now bent under the weight of doubt. Maybe the memories weren't proof of anything. Maybe they were just shadows of work that had already been forgotten, erased by time. And yet, somewhere beneath the heaviness, a flicker still remained, a small, stubborn voice that whispered, "Truth waits." I did not know how, or when, or where, but something in me clung to that fragile flame. Even as doubt grew, I could not let it extinguish what little hope I still carried. Because though I asked myself if he was right, I could not bring myself to believe it fully. My life could not have been nothing, not after all I had given, not after all I had endured. Still, The doubt stayed. It lingered with every step, every night, every silence. And I carried it like a shadow, waiting for something, anything that might one day prove it wrong. One evening, when the doubt felt heavier than usual, I found myself opening the old cupboard in my study. Its hinges creaked with the sound of years, as though even the wood had forgotten it still held something of worth. Inside were shelves layered with dust, stacks of folders whose edges had yellowed, boxes that had not been touched in decades. They looked like relics, forgotten and abandoned, and yet they were my relics, pieces of my life sealed away, unseen by the very people who believed I had done nothing. I pulled one folder from the shelf, its cover stiff and brittle, and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were letters, dozens of them, typed on fading paper, some handwritten in ink that had nearly vanished with time. I began to read. Words of thanks, words of recognition, words that spoke of nights and years when I had been there, when my work, my presence, my steady hand had mattered more than I had ever allowed myself to admit. One letter from a colleague. We couldn't have finished without you. No one else would have stayed as late, given as much, carried the burden the way you did. You may never get the credit, but those of us who were there, we know. Another from a former student. You believed in me when I was ready to give up. Without your encouragement, I would not be where I am today. You may think it was nothing, but to me, it was everything. I felt the words strike against the doubt that had been growing in me, not erasing it, but pushing back, like light breaking through a crack in a wall. I dug deeper, opening more folders, pulling out more fragments of my hidden past. Reports with my name on them, signatures marking the end of projects completed successfully, photographs where I stood in the background while others took the credit. And though the world had moved on, these papers had not. They waited, patiently, to remind me that the work I had given was real, even if unseen. In one box I found old awards, not grand or glittering, not the kind that made headlines, but acknowledgments nonetheless. Certificates given quietly, plaques engraved with my name, handed to me with a handshake that lasted a moment and forgotten by everyone else the next day. I had tucked them away then, too humble to display them, too occupied with moving forward to cling to the past. But now, holding them in my hands, I saw them differently. They were proof. Proof that my life had not been empty, that my contribution had not been nothing. Still, the folders, the letters, the plaques, they were all covered in dust. They had been buried, not because they had no meaning, but because no one had cared to ask. My family had never opened these drawers. My grandson had never stepped into this room to search for who I truly was. They looked at me and saw only the silence of age. They never looked deeper, never thought to ask what the silence contained. As I sat surrounded by these fragments, I felt both sorrow and strength. Sorrow because the evidence of my life's worth had been hidden for so long, unseen by those I loved most. Strength because I knew it existed, tangible and undeniable, waiting for the day someone would have no choice but to see it. The hidden past was not gone. It was only waiting. Waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows, to remind not only my grandson, but the whole world, that quiet lives are not empty lives, that sacrifices made, without applause, still shape the future, that sometimes the greatest legacies lie not in fame, but in the hidden rooms of memory, sealed in dust until truth itself calls them into the light. And as I closed the folder and set it gently back on the shelf, I whispered to myself, one day, these will speak louder than any careless words ever could. My grandson's admiration lived in a world that had no room for me. I watched the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of men who ran across fields with stadiums chanting their names, or women whose photographs filled the front pages of newspapers, smiling under the weight of medals and trophies. He carried magazines folded under his arm, scrolled endlessly on his phone, reciting facts about people he had never met, but who to him were larger than life. To him, greatness wore a suit, spoke from a stage, signed books, or held records written in bold letters. His voice grew eager when he spoke of them, as though even being able to repeat their names gave him some share of their light. And as he spoke, I could feel his gaze pass through me like I was nothing but air. His heroes lived on screens, in headlines, in photographs passed around the classroom. His grandfather lived in a chair at the corner of the room, a shadow too small to matter. I do not blame him for admiring greatness. Youth always looks to the brightest flame. What pierced me was how quickly he measured my worth against theirs and found me empty. In his world I had no stage, no applause, no cameras to prove I had ever mattered. He saw only the quiet old man who sat at the edge of family gatherings, whose clothes were simple, whose name never appeared in newsprint. To him, I was invisible. Yet, as I listened, I felt a strange ache. Not jealousy, not resentment, but grief. Grief that he had been raised to see only the loud kind of greatness, the kind that shines for a moment and fades, while the quieter kind, the kind that builds, that sacrifices, that sustains, passed him by unseen. He could not imagine that I had once carried responsibilities heavier than medals, that my victories were not celebrated in headlines, but in lives kept steady, in storms endured, in battles fought with no audience to clap at the end. I remembered nights when I returned home soaked from the rain after hours of work that no one noticed. Mornings when my body screamed with exhaustion, yet I rose again because duty does not rest. I remembered moments when one decision, made quietly and without fanfare, changed the course of someone else's life. But none of those moments had cameras. None had trophies. None left behind glossy photographs to hold in trembling hands. They lived only in memory, and memory, I had learned, does not impress the young. So I watched him from my corner, his voice filling the room with names and titles, his pride swelling for strangers, and I sat with the silence of my own name, buried under years of work that had never sought applause. It is a strange thing to realize that the people closest to you will believe strangers have done more for the world than you ever could, that your life, given in quiet sacrifice, seems to them like an empty shadow beside the brilliance of others. Still, deep inside, I clung to a truth he could not yet understand. Applause is fleeting, but legacy is not. Fame burns bright and fades quickly, but the work done in silence has a way of waiting, biding its time, until it rises in the most unexpected places. And though he could not see it yet, though to him I was only a shadow, I knew the day would come when he would have no choice but to look at me and truly see. It arrived on an ordinary morning, slipped among bills and advertisements, the kind of envelope you almost throw aside without opening. My hands were tired that day, clumsy from years of work that had left their marks, scars, calluses, veins raised like roads on a map. I almost tossed it with the rest, but something about the seal, the handwriting, made me pause. It bore the name of the school where my grandson studied. I opened it slowly, expecting nothing more than some notice, some polite reminder about a school event, but as my eyes scanned the page, my breath caught. The words were simple, yet they struck me harder than anything I had read in years. We would be honored if you could attend our upcoming ceremony. We wish to recognize your contributions with a special presentation. For a long moment I sat frozen, the letter trembling in my hands. Recognize me? My contributions? Had they mistaken me for someone else? I read it again, slower this time, every line searing into me. It was no mistake. They wanted me. Not as a guest in the crowd, not as a relative sitting quietly in the back, but as someone to be called forward, someone whose name would be spoken aloud. I leaned back in my chair, the walls of my small room pressing close, and felt memories flood me. Memories of long-forgotten nights, of tasks that felt invisible, of sacrifices no one ever seemed to notice. And now, suddenly, here it was, proof that at least somewhere, somehow, those hidden years had left a mark, that someone had remembered. And yet, even as hope flickered, doubt lingered. What if it was small? What if it was nothing more than a token, a polite gesture meant to fill a space in their program? What if my grandson, sitting among his classmates, looked at me the same way he always had, with that indifferent glance that said, "You're nobody. You've done nothing." I set the letter down on the table and stared at it, the ink blurring through the haze of my thoughts. My grandson's voice returned to me, sharp and cold. "You're not impressive." His words echoed against this invitation like two worlds colliding, the world of dismissal and the world of recognition. Which was true? Could they both be? I imagined the ceremony. The hall filled with students, teachers, families. My grandson sitting somewhere in the middle, his eyes wandering, expecting nothing of me. And then my name called, the principal's voice lifting it above the crowd, the sound of it ringing where he could not ignore it. Would it change him? Would he see me differently? Or would he shrug it off, blind even to truth when it stood before him? The thought both frightened me and gave me strength, because whether or not he saw, whether or not he understood, I knew one thing. I had been invited for a reason, and perhaps, after all these years of silence, the time had come for my story to step out from the shadows where it had been forced to hide. I folded the letter carefully, smoothing its edges with trembling hands, and placed it back into the envelope, as though it were something sacred. For me it was more than paper. It was a key to a door I thought had been locked forever, a key to justice I had long stopped expecting. And as I sat there, staring at the envelope on the table, I whispered into the empty room, "Maybe now, finally, he will see." The day of the ceremony came, and I walked slowly toward the school, the letter folded neatly in my pocket like a secret I wasn't sure I had the right to carry. The building loomed ahead, its doors wide open, spilling out the noise of children and the murmur of families gathering. My steps felt heavy, each one pressing with the weight of years, with the memories of words that had left me hollow. "You're not impressive." And yet, here I was, invited, expected, called into a place where my name would soon be spoken aloud. When I entered the hall, the sound of voices washed over me, laughter, whispers, the shifting of chairs. Rows upon rows of students sat in their uniforms, the air thick with the restless energy of youth. Parents lined the walls, teachers stood by the stage, and banners hung in colors of celebration. To everyone else, it was just another school event. To me, it felt like walking into judgment itself. I found my place near the back at first, unsure if I belonged, but soon an usher gestured me closer, to a seat reserved near the front, and the eyes of strangers followed me as I walked down the aisle. I could feel their curiosity, their quiet questions. Who is he? Why is he here? My shoulders bent under their gaze, but I pressed forward, my hands trembling against the cane I carried. And then I saw him. My grandson. He sat in the middle row, surrounded by his classmates, his posture relaxed, his face lit with the careless brightness of youth. When his eyes brushed over me, there was no flicker of pride, no recognition of what was about to unfold. His gaze slid past me as if I were just another old man filling a chair. He turned back to his friends, whispering something that made them chuckle. For him, my presence meant nothing. That glance cut sharper than the coldest words, because in it was the truth I had known for months. In his eyes, I was irrelevant. My name carried no weight, my years carried no meaning. And yet, even as the sting of that indifference seared into me, I felt something else stir inside, a quiet anticipation, because I knew what he did not. I knew that soon, the very hall he sat in, the very stage he stared at with boredom, would speak my name. and no indifference could silence that truth once it was spoken aloud. The ceremony began. Students were called up. Their names met with applause, their achievements read proudly. Parents clapped, cameras flashed, and the hall buzzed with pride. I sat silently, my hands folded, waiting. Every announcement, every cheer, felt like the drumbeat of time drawing me closer to the moment that would decide everything, not just for me, but for him. And yet, even in that waiting, doubt pressed close. What if the moment was small? What if it passed unnoticed? What if he never cared? What if the truth that mattered so much to me slid past him like my presence had, leaving me invisible once again? The fear clawed at me, but I held on to the letter, the invitation, the proof that someone, somewhere, had remembered. I sat there, a stranger among the clamor, my grandson's indifference burning into me. And still, beneath it all, I carried a fragile hope that before this day ended, the silence that had defined my life would finally break. The principal walked onto the stage with a quiet authority, the kind that settles a room without the need for raised voices. The restless buzz of students softened into silence, the sound of shifting chairs replaced by the steady rhythm of his steps. He carried no paper in his hand, only his voice and his presence. And when he began to speak, it was not in the hollow tone of ceremony, but in the voice of someone telling a story that mattered. At times, he began, true greatness does not appear in headlines. It does not wear medals or stand beneath bright lights. Sometimes, greatness works in silence, steady, unseen, patient. And though the world may not cheer, it is that kind of greatness that builds the very foundations we stand on today. The words pulled at me, though I sat still, hands folded tightly in my lap. He wasn't speaking about the famous people my grandson admired. He was speaking about someone else. And as his voice carried across the hall, the story began to take shape. He spoke of long years of service, of work done without recognition. He spoke of projects carried through against impossible odds, of nights spent in sacrifice so others could rest, of decisions made quietly that changed more than anyone realized at the time. He told of classrooms supported, communities strengthened, lives made better because one person had chosen to give and not count the cost. My chest tightened, my breath caught, because I knew. Every word he spoke carried the weight of my own memory, my own labor, my own sacrifices. This was not an abstract figure he was describing. This was me. The principal was weaving my life into the air of that hall, turning invisible years into a visible truth no one could ignore. I dared to glance toward my grandson. His head, once turned lazily toward his friends, was now facing forward, his brow slightly furrowed. He was listening. Maybe for the first time he was hearing a story of greatness, not measured in trophies or fame, but in endurance. And though he did not yet know whose story it was, I saw in his eyes a shift, curiosity, maybe even a flicker of awe. The principal's voice grew stronger. This is not the kind of story you will find in newspapers. You will not see it on television, but it is written in the lives of those who benefited, who stand taller today because of sacrifices made in silence. It is the story of someone among us. The hall grew even quieter. Parents leaned forward, students straightened in their chairs. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the whole room held its breath at once. My hands trembled against the wood of my cane. For years I had been dismissed, overlooked, mocked, even erased in the eyes of my own family. And now, here, in this hall filled with strangers, my life was being spoken back into existence. The principal paused, his gaze sweeping the room. And then, slowly, with the reverence of one unveiling something sacred, he prepared to say the name that had been buried in silence for too long. And I knew, when that name left his lips, nothing would ever be the same again. The principal spoke my name, and in an instant, the silence of the hall was no longer empty. It was alive. vibrating with recognition. I felt it ripple through the crowd like a quiet wave. The students, who had been shifting restlessly in their chairs moments before, sat straighter. The teachers, lined along the walls, began to nod, some exchanging glances as if they too understood the weight of what had just been spoken. Faces changed, expressions softened. Indifference gave way to attention. But it was not the strangers that pierced me most. It was my grandson. When the story had begun, his gaze was wandering, drifting between his friends and the ceiling, his body slouched with the ease of someone expecting nothing meaningful. But as the principal's words wrapped tighter around the truth of my life, I noticed the shift. His head tilted forward, his brows furrowed in concentration, his laughter faded into silence. And then, when my name was spoken aloud, his eyes found me. For the first time in years, he did not look past me. He looked at me. There was no smirk now, no mask of indifference, only confusion. Confusion tinged with something deeper, something that looked like the fragile beginning of respect. It was as though he was seeing me not as the old man in the corner chair, not as the shadow at the family table, but as someone entirely new, or perhaps as someone I had always been, but whom he had never allowed himself to recognize. I could feel the weight of countless eyes turning my way. Children who did not know me whispered softly to one another, their curiosity spilling over in glances. Teachers folded their arms, their nods slow and deliberate, as if confirming that justice was long overdue. Even parents I had never met leaned forward, their faces filled with the quiet admiration reserved for those whose worth had been hidden too long. The hall itself seemed to change. What had been just another school event was now something sacred, a place where truth finally rose from the shadows. And there I sat, my cane steady in my hand, my body trembling under the force of their recognition. I thought of the years I had walked unnoticed, of the silence that had wrapped around my work, of the indifference that had pierced me in my own home. All of it seemed to collapse into this single moment, when eyes that had once dismissed me now lingered with respect. I thought of my grandson's words, "You're not impressive." And as his eyes clung to mine, I saw those words crumble. Not because I had shouted, not because I had argued, but because truth had spoken louder than both of us. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I sat in silence, letting the weight of the moment speak for me. And in that silence, I felt justice stir. Not as thunder, not as vengeance, but as recognition. The eyes in the room told the story my lips no longer needed to tell. And in the gaze of my grandson, unsteady and shaken, I saw the first cracks in the wall he had built against me. For the first time, he could not look away. The principal's voice rang through the hall, steady and clear. "Today we present an honorary award," and then came my name. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The sound echoed against the walls, heavy with truth, undeniable. Applause broke out, first scattered, then stronger, until it filled the entire room. Hands clapped, voices rose, and yet all I heard was the thundering of my own heart. I stood slowly, my cane pressing against the floor, my legs trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of the moment. The stage felt impossibly far away, each step an eternity. But as I walked, heads turned, eyes followed. Respect, real, unfeigned, lit their faces. And then I looked to where my grandson sat. He was frozen, his mouth slightly open, his friends staring at him in surprise. His eyes were wide, not with scorn, not with indifference, but with something I had waited a lifetime to see. Recognition. When I reached the stage, the principal placed the plaque in my hands. Its weight was nothing compared to the years I had carried on my shoulders, but in that moment it felt heavier than gold. He shook my hand firmly, and the hall erupted again in applause. I did not speak. I did not need to. The award gleamed beneath the lights, my name carved into it for all to see. It was louder than any defense I could have made, louder than the cruelest words ever spoken against me. And in the crowd, my grandson lowered his gaze, then lifted it again, this time unable to turn away. For the first time, he saw me. I stood on the stage, the plaque resting in my hands, the lights pouring down like a quiet spotlight of justice. I did not search for words, because there were none I needed to speak. My silence was not weakness this time. It was strength. The award itself spoke for me, louder than any defense, sharper than any argument. The applause washed over me, but I did not smile, did not lift the award high. I simply stood there, letting the weight of that moment carry its truth into every corner of the hall. For years, I had been silenced by indifference, buried beneath whispers of irrelevance. Now that silence had become my weapon. I did not need to shout. I only needed to exist in the light of recognition they could no longer deny. I glanced across the sea of faces. Teachers nodded, some with quiet pride, as though they had always known my work mattered. Parents leaned forward, whispering to one another. Students watched with wide eyes, struck by the idea that greatness did not always roar. Sometimes it stood quietly with a cane, holding a plaque, saying nothing at all. And then, my gaze found him, my grandson. He sat motionless, his friends staring at him with surprise, waiting for his reaction. His cheeks were pale, his eyes locked on me. I saw the battle within him. The memory of his own words, the arrogance of his earlier dismissal, colliding with the undeniable truth now standing before him. He could no longer hide behind indifference. I did not need to tell him he was wrong. I did not need to demand respect. My silence carried all of it. The weight of the award, the roar of the applause, the name etched forever into the plaque, these were my answers. And as I stood there, I realized justice had come not in boasting or vengeance, but in quiet dignity. I had been called unimpressive, invisible, forgotten, yet here I was, honored not for noise, but for endurance, for years of work that had finally broken through the shadows. The hall was silent now, waiting for me to speak, but I remained still, letting the truth breathe in the silence. And in that silence, I knew. They all understood. That evening, when the applause faded and the hall emptied, I remained still for a long while, the plaque resting against my chest like a shield I had waited a lifetime to carry. I could feel its weight, not in metal or wood, but in the truth it bore, truth that no voice, no whisper, no careless insult could erase again. The ceremony ended and students spilled out with laughter. Teachers shook hands, parents gathered their children. I stood quietly, the noise around me a blur, my heart steady in a way it had not been in years. For once, I did not feel the urge to explain myself, to defend my past, to remind anyone of what I had done. I had nothing left to prove. The proof was already there, carved into the plaque, engraved into the silence that had wrapped around me on that stage. And then I saw him. My grandson. He approached slowly, his steps hesitant, as if weighed down by something heavier than shame. Gone was the careless tone with which he once dismissed me. Gone was the easy arrogance in his eyes. He looked at me differently now, his gaze unsteady but raw, as though he was seeing me for the very first time. There were no words between us. None were needed. Respect is not always spoken aloud. Sometimes it is carried in the way eyes soften, in the way a head bows slightly, in the way silence itself becomes an offering. For years I had been invisible to him. For years he had seen me as a shadow of no consequence, a relic fading quietly into irrelevance. But now, in that one long moment, all of that crumbled. His silence no longer mocked, it honored. His eyes no longer dismissed. They admitted what his lips had once denied. I mattered. I thought back to the nights of doubt, the whispers of irrelevance, the sting of hearing him laugh with his friends at my supposed emptiness. I remembered the weight of memory, the folders filled with forgotten letters, the hidden past I had clung to alone. And now all of it stood vindicated. Every sacrifice, every quiet act of endurance, every moment spent in shadows had led here, to this hall, to this moment when truth rose higher than lies. Justice did not come in the form of confrontation. It did not come in raising my voice or demanding apologies. It came in the simplest of ways, in the look of a boy who finally saw the man before him, not as useless, not as unimpressive, but as worthy. And in that look, I felt my name restored, not in the newspapers, not in the echoes of fame, but in the eyes of the one who had once erased me. That was the justice I had longed for, not applause, not honor, but recognition from my own blood. That night, as I left the hall with the plaque pressed against me, I no longer carried the stone of his words in my chest. The weight had been lifted, replaced by something lighter, brighter, unshakable. My legacy was no longer hidden in folders or dust or silence. It was alive, standing in the eyes of a grandson who would never again be able to say, he never accomplished anything, because from that day forward, he knew the truth. My life was not empty. It had never been empty. And now, no one, not strangers, not family, not even doubt itself, could take that away from me again. Justice had come, not in thunder, not in noise, but in the quiet power of respect finally earned, finally returned. And in that quiet, my legacy was restored forever.